Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of the entire IT Acquisition Working Group, I'm Danielle Mao, and I just want to take a moment to welcome you to this offering of the first training module developed and delivered by this GSA team. This training is based on our IT acquisition competency model and the needs of the workforce in this contingency contracting environment. So we're very happy to share this milestone in our work with each of you. And whether you purchase IT or not, this course will be very engaging. You'll be using the chat, so get your tea or your afternoon coffee, turn your thinking caps on, and take a break from all of the other workload that will surely continue once you're off this call. So this is an opportunity for us to test modules of our curriculum with you all as we shape a future FACSI IT Plus certification program, and it's being designed with the virtual environment and our skills gap assessment results in mind. So we thank everyone who maybe has used our learning resource tool already to watch, read, or listen your way to CLPs, and we invite you to be our candid test pool today and enjoy interacting with us on your way to even more CLPs. We'll continue to keep you updated as new resources become available. And again, because this is part of our beta testing process, I really do request your candid feedback on the course through the end of course survey and emails directly to me, danielle.mao@gsa.gov. And that's because we want to continually improve our offerings and better meet your needs. So like all GSA training offered for CLPs, this course does include a post-course assessment, which Chris alluded to. So open up your attachments. You've got to receive a score of at least 80% to get your 1.5 hours. And we strongly recommend that you utilize the slides and the handout to complete your post-course assessment. Our time together is very short, and I just want to turn things over now to our extraordinarily capable and knowledgeable instructor for this afternoon, Mr. Matsushima. He is very experienced, bringing more than 40 years of contracting experience, many as a U.S. Navy Supply Corps officer working in a contingency contracting environment. So you've got a great instructor today, and I will turn it over to him now. And thank you again so much.
Well, thank you, Danielle. My name is Rodney Matsushima, and I am privileged to take you through the next hour where we'll be talking about emergency contracting. I'd like to remind all of you to download the files from the class files pod because there's some good information there. The presentation is there and a handout that you're going to find very useful. So while we're doing this, I encourage you to download the files. This is our agenda for today. Basically, for the first half an hour, we'll go through some of the important aspects of the FAR system that supports emergency acquisitions or contracting under emergency conditions. And the system consists of the FAR, your GSA supplement, and then the ecosystem includes some Office of Management and Budget memos, some letters from the Civilian Agency Acquisition Council, and then your internal memorandums and letters from your senior procurement executive and class deviations that support you. So we'll go through all of those. Then I'll go through this handout, which we're calling the chronological sequence of events, where we've taken all of those memorandums and letters and put them in sequence for you to keep for future use. We'll finally end with 2 case studies where we're going to do some discussions, some brainstorming to put some of what we've discussed into real context. So let's look at the learning objectives for this hour. The key is I'm going to try and explain how the FAR system operates in supporting those of you that are at the working level under emergency contracting conditions. Then we're going to look at some of the key events that cause this to activate the emergency condition. some of the laws and of course the FAR regulation that apply to emergency acquisitions. And then this is as a result of the discussions we're going to have on some case studies. It gives you some idea on what might be a traditional method in meeting the requirement, or what might be some innovative or non-traditional processes or methods that are used in the emergency acquisition conditions. So here's a timeline, and again, we're using COVID-19 as the example for contracting under some emergency conditions, and we're all living it today. It's hard to believe that it's just been 6 months, December, when we started hearing about COVID-19. The first case was reported in January of this year. Then in March, President declared a national emergency, which then caused a lot of the FAR system to start operating. And for all of you, if you're on a team that is using some of the flexibilities from the system to support COVID-19 requirements, that's what you're living under. And this is a chart that we created to kind of explain what is available within the system. And it starts here on the left. It ends on the right where all of you reside. This is where you're the working level. You're doing pre and post award actions that are supporting the emergency conditions. So a way of looking at this is here in this first circle are some of what's already available within the FAR system. As you know, many laws, if it affects the acquisition community, would end up in the FAR. And there is a law called the Stafford Act, which really defines emergency acquisition. And that then was implemented in the FAR in FAR Parts 18 and 26. The Office of Federal Procurement Policy has issued an emergency acquisition guide that came out in 2011. And there was some pre-planning already done by many of the agencies, and GSA, of course, always participates in emergencies. And so there were some pre-planning documents that were already put in place that we'll talk about as we go through this hour. So as we go across this chart, this second circle talks about there was a public health emergency that was declared in January, and that was issued by the Health and Human Services Agency. And what these emergency declarations do is it allows the federal government to assist state and local governments with funding and other personnel support and whatnot. You know, the basic first line of defense for any of these emergencies is with the state and local governments. When we have a declared emergency, the federal government then is allowed and provides additional support. So this third circle represents when President declared a national emergency, and that was done in March, on March the 13th, retroactive to March the 1st. This then caused the Office of Management and Budget to issue a number of memos that provided guidance to the agencies. The Civilian Agency Acquisition Council issued 2 letters, again, uh, recommending some action for agencies to consider. Then you at GSA took some action by issuing some senior procurement executive letters and some class deviations that would help support anybody within GSA that has been tasked with supporting the COVID-19 emergency conditions. So that's how I would look at this chart. Now we're going to go into some of the individual items from this chart. Just a quick look at the Stafford Act, and the title is Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act of 1988. So you can see it's been around for a while. That act authorizes the president to declare a major disaster or emergency in response to an incident. We're going to go into the definition of major disaster and emergency right after this chart. That act also authorized the delivery of federal technical, financial, logistical, and other assistance to states and local governments, localities. Again, first line of defense are the states and local governments. The declared emergency allows the federal government to provide this type of support. The act also designated FEMA to be the coordinator for disaster relief. And if you went on to the FEMA site, you'll see that there are dozens of disasters or emergencies that have been declared, but they're very localized. And you know, I personally did not realize how many we had, how many emergencies have been declared until I looked at that site. So here's the definition of an emergency. So it's any occasion or instance for which, in the determination of the president, federal assistance is needed to supplement state and local efforts. And this is to save lives and protect property and public health and safety. Now, a major disaster means any natural catastrophe. So we hear a lot about this. It's hurricane season, tornado season, and so those are very localized. High water, those are natural catastrophes. Or, regardless of cause, any fire, flood, or explosion in any part of the United States that in the determination of the president causes damage of sufficient severity and magnitude to warrant major disaster assistance. Here, the definition is a little different because it talks about providing supplemental efforts to states, local governments, and here it's added Native American tribal governments and disaster relief organizations. The Stafford Act really talks toward support to very localized areas, and so it's added this. There is an emergency acquisitions guide. It was created by the office. It's a combination of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, and they had a working group called the Emergency Response and Recovery Working Group that created this guide. This is a link to the guide, but we also will provide it to you in the attachment. And the guide was put together from experiences from many of the agencies, and it covered these 4 areas. pre-emergency planning. So what should agencies do before a disaster occurs? How do you put some processes in place that when emergency occurs, you're ready to go? It talks about things like you should have a go bag for people who are designated to go to and support an emergency. And here are the contents of the go bag. The second part talks about emergency operations. Um, some such things as you should consider increasing the thresholds, increasing the micro purchase threshold, or increasing the simplified acquisition threshold automatically if you are sending contracting officers. And what would you have in place to allow them to support the increase in thresholds if their warrants, for example, may not cover that. So how do you handle those things? Then there's a section that is to be read along with FAR Part 18 and 26. And that's the third bullet here. It talks about the flexibilities for emergencies, and that's covered in FAR Part 18. And finally, the last part is more of a best practices, questions and answers that talk about disaster and contingency contracting lessons learned. So it's a very good guide. It's not very long. It's only 22 pages. So I would recommend all of you read this when you have some time. So let's look at FAR Part 18. And 18 has a definition in it, and it's got two subparts, 18.1 and 18.2. It is your key FAR part that talks about emergency acquisitions. And it's a little deceiving because it's only 6 pages, but it covers all the different situations and refers you to many different parts of the FAR. So a good way, I think, to show this is for me to go to FAR Part 18. And so here's FAR Part 18. It starts with, of course, a table of contents, but let's look at the definition. So can all of you see this? Feel free to type in your questions in the chat pod if you have any. But here's the definition of emergency acquisition flexibilities. So they are, as used in this part, means flexibilities provided with respect to any acquisition of supplies or services by or for an executive agency that, as determined by the head of the executive agency, may be used either in support of contingency operations, to facilitate the defense against or recovery from cyber, nuclear, biological, chemical, or radiological attack, or C, in support of a request by State Department or USAID for international disaster assistance, and D, which is what applies to us under COVID, when the president issues an emergency declaration or a major disaster declaration. And the way to read FAR Part 18.1, which covers a whole bunch of different subjects. And so let's look at synopsis of proposed contract actions and see what it says. It says, contracting officers need not submit a synopsis notice when there is an unusual and compelling urgency and the government would be seriously injured if the agency complied with the notice time periods. and gives you the FAR site, FAR Part 5. So I'm asking you right now, what is the current notice requirements under the FAR? What are the synopsis requirements? Then the solicitation. So what threshold must you synopsize a requirement? What is the threshold currently in the FAR? Can anybody tell me that? And I'm looking for so I'm not seeing here, I'm not seeing your responses. So let me continue here. The way this reads, currently the notice requirements is anything above $25,000. You must synopsize the requirement, and then you would put your solicitation document, post it 15 days after the synopsis, and then you must leave the solicitation out on the street for 30 days. That's the FAR regulatory requirement. What this says is agencies may limit the number of sources for full and open competition. Well, their contract analysis need not submit a synopsis notice when there is an unusual and compelling urgency. That declaration provides you with the justification that this is unusual and compelling, and therefore you can process this without having to synopsize or keep the time frames. So this is how you have to read 18, and it covers many different subjects. So here's unusual and compelling, what you would use under FAR Part 6. Here's a section on GSA schedules. Here's a section on buying from the federal prison industries, or Ability 1, the blind made products. Here's one on qualifications. Agencies may determine not to enforce qualification requirements when an emergency exists. But you're going to have to go to FAR Part 9.206-1 to really understand what that's saying. So this is how you're going to have to read 18, because it's going to refer you to the other parts of the FAR. Oral request for proposals, use of letter contracts. You can see a lot of different subject areas. So my recommendation is you need to be very familiar with FAR Part 18 because it provides you with places to go to for the situations that you have and what you need to do to justify it. 18.2 then talks about the specific under that definition. Remember, we have contingency operations. So here's more guidelines on contingency operations, or if your defense or recovery from certain events, you follow 18.2. And 18.3 is where we are. Emergency declaration or major disaster declaration. And so this refers you to FAR Part 26 and basically says preference will be given to local organizations, firms, and individuals when contracting for major disaster. So you see, it really was geared towards localized disasters, whereas COVID-19 is very different, right? This is national, this is global, and so many, you may not have it localized enough. But if you did, it was a hurricane that hit a specific part of Florida, for example, now you'd be using local set-asides. And that's what FAR Part 26.2 talks about. And the last thing I wanted to show you, there's a section on resources. And so again, FEMA is responsible. They have a national response framework, and here's the link to it. And here it talks about the OFPP guidelines, or that emergency acquisitions guide, and a link to that guide here, right in the FAR. So that's how FAR Part 18 operates. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. And I now see the chat. Lydia was correct, 25,000. But for some reason, I could not see it when I went to share the document. Let's go to part 26. 26 talks about the preference now to use only local area firms. So you've got a local area preference, a local area set aside, an evaluation preference for local area. And then when you transition work, you may have started nationally, but then you have to transition from that national company to a local company if the local company can do the work. It talks about the national, the disaster response registry that you can access in SAM, and companies register there. If something occurs in the area where the company is located, you can go to that registry, and that gives you the information on the companies that are available. And you can go and contract directly with them. So that's how 26 supports emergency conditions. Let's now quickly go to OMB memorandums. So OMB issued in 2011 through one of their memorandums, the OFPP Emergency Acquisitions Guide. And then after the declaration, 12 memos were issued to all of the executive agencies, and they covered these three general topics: management of agency operations and personnel. There were 5 memos, and they talked about considerations that agencies should think about, and for example, telework or travel considerations. Start thinking about, are you going to allow your organization personnel to telework? Are you going to allow contractors to telework and whatnot? So those types of things. Then there were 3 memos that addressed grants and cooperative agreements, pre-award considerations, and post-award considerations. 4 memos that talked about acquisition and pre-award considerations, post-award considerations. Those memos then are looked at by every agency, and agencies then would issue their own directives. But prior to that, we also received 2 letters from the Civilian Agency Acquisition Council, and these were recommendations or consultation letters that recommended that agencies consider issuing a class deviation for these 2 items. One was a class deviation to pay small businesses within 15 days. And the other was to change the progress payment rates to 95% and 90% for small and large business before the FAR is updated. So understanding it's going to take a while to get through the rulemaking process, they recommended that agencies consider a class deviation because this is going to happen, but that way you can start paying small businesses in 15 days or less if you would issue a class deviation. So that generated a number of your own senior procurement executive memorandums from Jeffrey Kosis, and you can see the titles. But the first one, 06, talks about consideration for teleworking, again, in response to the OMB memo. The second, though, SPE 2020-07, occurred one day after the declaration of national emergency, and it talked about basically for anyone that's going to be working at GSA in support of COVID-19 requirements. Now the micro purchase threshold has been moved to $20,000 for in US and $30,000 outside the US. The simplified acquisition threshold has been moved up to $750,000. And that memo also issued a new National Interest Action Code, P20 Charlie or C. And so that was a really critical SPE letter. And then we had two more letters that came out talking about defining what would be a GSA essential critical infrastructure activities. And finally, one that talked about the Trade Agreements Act and Buy American Act. These are the class deviations that were created and promulgated. And so the first talks about signatures for bonds. Well, it allows electronic signatures, whereas before we needed to have the actual signatures in writing. This second class deviation talked about the notification for non-competitive procurements. The notification requirement was 30 days, and now it's been moved on this class deviation to 3 days. The third 07 class deviation allows your suspension and debarment group to use video conferencing instead of having to meet in person. The class deviation 08 is the one that allowed the payment to small businesses over 15 days and less. And finally, the last class deviation talked about paid leave reimbursement authority that you might consider for contractors that are affected by COVID-19. So a lot occurred, and what we did for all of you was we took all of those memos and letters, and we created a document, which is this attachment here. It's a summary in chronological order of all of the relevant documents that we talked about, including some of the documents that occurred prior to. And so you've got the date of the document, who issued it, you've got the document title, then a summary of what's in the document with some additional comments. And finally, every icon here, there's a link attached to it. And that link will give you the actual document. So if you click on it, it will bring up the PDF form that is the document. So this covers everything in chronological order. I recommend that you download this if you haven't downloaded it already. And when you have some time to sit down and just read through this document with some peace and quiet, I think you'll see it's going to be a really great help for you for not only this emergency, but every emergency that comes up. So this is, as Lisa says, this is available here in this class files pod, and it's something that I think you would really find useful. So let's go back, and I want to get to our exercise. So just in summary, uh, I've gone through now every one of these circles, and you have now a document that's in chronological order that summarized everything and has a link to each document that you can use. So let's kind of put what we've discussed into action. And what I'd like to do in this case is I'm going to give you a scenario, and I'd like you to answer in chat. Um, so the first scenario is this. Here's the scenario. And I'm going to make it bigger. Okay. You are a contracting officer or contract specialist. You could be a technical person that has to create the requirement. And you receive an urgent requirement to buy N95 masks. This has come up for everybody. But you're buying it for all the key personnel at GSA. Now, how would you go about getting the N95 mask as quickly as humanly possible? So we're brainstorming now, right? So type in your response. What would you do? What would you consider? What are the first things you would do? If it's not available there, what else you might do? We're just sharing our thoughts. So I see a number of people are starting to write. That's great. This is our chance to share some of our thoughts. One question would be, is this within the simplified acquisition threshold? Or would you consider buying it under the micro purchase threshold? Would you have to synopsize? There's a lot of considerations. And of course, as Michelle says, off schedule. Well, your GSA N95 masks are typically commercial items. So you may already have a schedule. You may already know of some companies that have schedules. And you, like Annalise says, I might just, because I need to go quickly, I might use a micro purchase threshold. If it's I'll just stay within the threshold, and I can then I'll use a purchase card. I don't have to compete. I don't have to worry about small business set aside or whatnot under micro purchase threshold. So what else? What else? So Lydia says, I first check the schedules. If not there, cry a little, and then start the process to determine the best path, right? So one of the paths might be I'm going to put out a synopsis, or I might have a standing quote. So I've got lots of things in my toolkit that I can consider to expedite buying the N95 mask. Chester says, read FAR Part 18, check availability of masks for the needed quantity, find alternative sources for supply, look into waivers. Absolutely, Chester. And again, everybody's looking for N95 masks. So you may be in a situation where everybody you've talked to don't have any. N95 masks actually are primarily created by the manufacturing is primarily in China. Does the Trade Agreements Act apply? Buy American Act. And so FAR Part 18 and your class deviation helps you in that respect. So there are a lot of different things to consider. And so here's another question, and let me so you find someone on a sole source basis, of course, but you need to justify the price. Okay, that the price is fair and reasonable. How would you do that? How would you justify that the price that you will be paying is fair and reasonable? What technique are you using in this environment to justify that the price is fair and reasonable? And what happens if the price that you're quoted is double what you think is fair and reasonable? So Darius says market research. Absolutely. Market research would be you'd be looking to find what prices are available through either market research could be looking at prices that you paid previously, or prices that are on GSA schedules, or existing price lists from different companies that sell. Those you get that through market research. Well, what kind of analysis are you now conducting when you are doing this? When you're trying to determine how to justify that the price is fair and reasonable? What type of analysis is this? So you could be comparing similar products, as Chester says, but in doing that, what kind of analysis are you conducting? My question to all of you is, what do we call this type of analysis? Okay, I see a number of people typing. Absolutely, Chester. Price analysis, as opposed to cost analysis, where we are looking at the individual elements of cost. In price analysis, we're looking at the bottom line prices. We are comparing the prices with maybe previous prices that we bought for the same items, prices we paid for similar items. But the best method would have been competition. But in this environment for COVID-19, we find we don't really have a lot of competition, and we don't have the time. But you still will need to justify how you determined that the price was fair and reasonable. So price analysis techniques are what you'll be using. Now let's look at some of the cases in this respect. Okay, so we looked at Fed BizOps and now SAM at what a number of different agencies have been doing, and as a traditional method, many agencies are putting out sources sought notices. And GSA has one out. That's a general notice that's being out there for a month or more, and basically asking, if you can provide any of these items, and N95 mask happens to be one of them, let us know. And so you can see that Veterans Affairs has one, GSA, almost everybody has a sources sought type notice that's out there. Now, FEMA had an interesting change to that, and I'd say this is kind of non-traditional or innovative in that they have a standing combined synopsis solicitation that has no closing date. But what's interesting about it is they're saying that we are going to award everything on a sole source single award basis, and it's going to have to be firm fixed price. So if you respond to this, we may give you the award immediately, but you have to give us a firm fixed price quote. and this is under FAR Part 12 because that's the only place that allows combined synopsis solicitation. Uh, but also within that, their solicitation, and you can see they did some learning, right? Because they're on Amendment 8 of that solicitation. As questions came in, they had to change it to to be able to support everything. Uh, but that standing solicitation said FOB destination anywhere in the U.S. And it also said if the amount is under 13 million, we're either going to use FAR Part 8 or FAR Part 13 procedures. If it's over, well, we're going to use FAR Part 8 and FAR Part 12 procedures because FAR Part 12 can be used along with FAR Part 13, 14, or 15. So I consider that kind of a innovative method that they use to allow them to support whatever anybody that can come in with something that they want to buy. They're telling the world that how they're doing it. Finally, the DLA used the other transactions method, and only a few agencies within the federal government have other transaction authority. But this is, again, I would consider this innovative because what they did was they asked for white papers, and they're not asking for N95 masks. They're asking for equivalent. They're asking for you to come in with something that is as good or better. I'm giving you a problem statement as the requirement. Come in to us and tell us why what you're going to provide meets the requirement for an N95 mask. And if we like it, we're going to award a contract to you to deliver some prototypes. When we test the prototype and it meets the requirement, then we're going to award a contract to you to start manufacturing that equivalent product. So this is an interesting way of doing it. I think we need to wait to see if they were able to get some, what the results of this were. We haven't seen that yet, but I just wanted to show you some innovative thinking that's out there. So here's another scenario, and let me get it. So here's another scenario that I'd like you to provide your thoughts and comments like we did the first. And this can happen to you today. So you're, again, the contracting officer, specialist, or technical person. But this time you're located in a small location, Parkersburg. Someone tested positive for coronavirus, and you need to immediately clean the facilities. So you need to find somebody that can come in and clean the facilities so that the rest of the staff can come back in, and you need it immediately. Your government estimate is $25,368. So what are some of your thoughts? So how would you meet that requirement? Okay, I see a number of people typing. I welcome all of you to comment, even ask questions, because we're brainstorming. If we had more time, we would have been able to take this even deeper. But since we only had an hour, we're brainstorming right now. Okay, so Chester says, do we already have someone on contract? That's very possible, but are they, even though they're on contract, would they be willing to come in and do the extra things that might be required to clean a COVID-19 infested facility. I'm not sure. Um, use the GSA O&M contract. Of course, the first things you're going to look to see is, do we already have somebody on contract? That's the first people you would talk to. If the answer is no, then what do? Well, you need to get the right funds, as Lydia says, but you need to find someone willing to do the work at a price that you can justify to be fair and reasonable, as Lydia says. And then you need to decide the vehicle, as Chester says, right? Do you use a purchase order? Do you use an unpriced purchase order? Because you may not have time to really, you may be still negotiating. Do you use some other vehicle? Do you use a letter contract? Do you use a purchase card? There's a number of choices, but it really depends on what is the contractor willing to accept. Also, that's a big part of it. Do you have, so Christine talks about negotiating a discount to get under the micro purchase. That if you want to use the micro purchase, you have to get under the 20,000. But would they be willing to do that? If not, you need to think of another way. So, this is a real example, and it's, the pressure is on the contract specialist, contracting officer. Again, you're going to need to justify that the price that you're willing to pay is fair and reasonable, but you may not have enough time to negotiate it. So how do you turn them on? These are all questions that you need to consider. And here's what occurred. So this was a real case that we got from SAM. They put their sole source justification on there, and it was a simplified acquisition justification. But they use a letter contract, which is interesting. And again, the FAR Part 18 talks about use of a letter contract. And they did not synopsize in SAM. But they got the work turned on. What the other thing I saw on there is the company that they brought in was not registered in SAM. So they had to justify awarding it to them or getting a quote and awarding it to them immediately, even though they weren't registered in SAM. So emergency conditions cause a lot, but really to be innovative, you need to understand what you can and cannot do. So this was a quick 1 hour, and so I'm opening it up to questions if you have any. If you have not downloaded the files, I recommend that you do it. And this gives you just a flavor of the kind of things that we could do in a classroom setting if we had more time.
And Rodney, this is Danielle just piping in. I just want to thank everyone for your participation. Thank you again, Rodney.
Yeah, I want to thank all of you. I know we did a lot over the 1 hour, but I hope this helped, and I hope we all get to see each other again sometime in the future.